Welcome back. Last time I finished up the engine reassembly and got it ready to accept the clutch and transmission. This time I'll be installing a new clutch and doing some work to the transmission so it shifts better. The clutch is ready to go after cleaning up the flywheel surface and installing a new pilot bearing. I discovered that my car already has a single mass conversion kit, which means the flywheel isn't separated into two parts. This doesn't mean it's lightweight, but it is a different design than OEM, so I was sure to buy the correct clutch from Valeo. The install was easy. I was sure to use the alignment tool to make sure the transmission would be able to insert properly. The clutch plate goes on after wiping off all the grease from shipping. Then, all the bolts get tightened up. I remove the alignment tool, and with that, the clutch install is done. So it was actually my first clutch install, and it was easier than expected. Now it's time to move on to the transmission. First off, it was filthy, so I spent a while cleaning it, just like every other part in this greasy car. I removed the old transmission mounts I'll be replacing with solid mounts. Then I took off the selector joint, pin, and clip. Because this is an H-pattern gearbox, these parts rotate to select the column and slide in and out to select the row. Play anywhere in the rotating bits causes left and right slop in the shifter. As you can see, this one has all this grime mashed into it. This means it must be worn out, which explains the slop. Unfortunately, if the rod that goes in the transmission is worn, it isn't easy to fix. I replaced the pin and clip to try and tighten things up later once the transmission was in the car. Next up, I moved on and replaced the shift pins. There are 3 of these, one for each column. The process for all 3 is the same. First, drill a hole in the cap. Thread a coarse screw into the hole and do your best to pry it out with a crowbar. This doesn't always work, and of course it was the most difficult for the one I filmed.
Right.
Eventually, I got it out by going to a bigger screw once the hole was ruined. The spring comes out, and then the pin in front of it. From here on, you need a special set of tools to complete the job. The first tool is used to punch in the new bushing to the correct depth. Then, the new shift pin goes in. Notice how this design is different. The pin is smaller and slides along the added bushing. Then the spring goes back in and a new cap gets punched in using another of the special tools that fits just right. With the pins done, it's time to move on to the detents. These return the shifter back to center when going towards 5th and reverse. The cap for these is plastic, and it's easier to get out than the pins after the circlip comes off, or in my case, gets mangled off. These also have a spring inside, but the slidey bit can be much more difficult to get out. One method is to use these expanding screws to grab the detent to get it out, but this didn't work for me. What did work was simply expanding my needle nose pliers as hard as I could and pulling to get the detent out. Unfortunately, once this did come out, the worst was still yet to come. The bushing inside is nearly impossible to get out. Hammering into it and destroying it along the seam is really the only way to be able to grab onto it. This process was awful and took quite a long time, scratching up the inside cylinder in the process. I sanded the inside surface down so there at least weren't any large scratches left. Now, using another special tool, the new bushing gets punched in. Then, the new detent goes in, making sure it's the right one and it's facing the right direction. The old spring goes back in, then another special tool gets used to hammer in the cap. This cap is a pain since it isn't tight enough to hold itself in. It needs a circlip. Once I get the circlip most of the way in, I was able to use a tool to punch it into place, seating it nicely. first detent was done off camera. There's 2 total, so now I'm done, and not a moment too soon. I played around with the input rod and was able to feel the difference. So it returns to center both when you go towards first gear and towards 5th gear. Before, it wasn't returning to center at all when you're going towards 5th gear, so that's good that it fixed that. Nice. 1, 2, and 3. I removed the slave cylinder to check its condition and clean behind it. It looked fine, so I continued on to the bell housing. I removed the clutch fork and plastic pivot pin that I'll be replacing with a metal one. The new metal pivot pin gets installed with a few taps to make sure it's seated. I grease up the pin and sleeve cylinder before reinstalling the fork. The input shaft needs a good cleaning grease to prevent binding along with the fork surfaces. A new greased up throwout bearing goes on, applying some, but not too much grease to the contact points. The transmission is finally ready to go. I drained the fluid before installing on the engine. Look at that dark color, so much for the fluid being lifetime. Actually, it's probably reasonable if lifetime is less than 20 years. The transmission took a bit to line up, but eventually I got it in place, not forgetting any of the Torx bolts or the shield. I spent plenty of time researching what fluid to use, but ultimately I decided the Redline MTL I bought last year would do just fine. The fill plug gets reinstalled with some sealant applied to both the drain and fill plug to prevent leakage. Finally, I took off the crusty old clutch line that I'll be replacing with a braided line once the parts come in. Apparently, some of these cards have a delay valve that should be removed, but either mine didn't come with one or someone else beat me to it. And with that, the transmission and clutch are done. As usual, thanks for watching, feel free to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next part where the engine gets reinstalled, and then we can see how it runs.